Hello, everyone. This is a message from the Oak Lodge Governance Project. Today we have Alexander Nelson with us, who will be presenting financial information on the city of Gladstone. So Alexander is completing his Master of Public Administration with a concentration in local government management through Portland State University. He has a professional background in land use planning and public involvement consulting. And in the last month, he's moved to Colorado to work for Arapahoe County as a management analyst. While he no longer lives in Oregon, he was born and raised in the beautiful state and is thrilled to work on a project that provides such tangible information and incorporates so many of his local government interests. I've been working with Alexander for several months, and I'm just delighted to have him here today to share with us some of the information that he's come up with. So Alexander, take it away. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Eleanor and team. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Let's see here. Okay, looks like we're up and running. So yes, thank you again. As Eleanor mentioned, my name is Alexander Nelson, and I'll be talking about looking at really annexing and with a slight potential and discussion on incorporation, annexing into Gladstone and incorporating with Gladstone service levels for the Oak Lodge study area. So I just want to provide a brief overview of what this presentation will cover, and it'll be a really brief overview of the background of the project, a discussion of Gladstone, the services they provide, and some different looks at finances for the city. And then we'll talk about different values for both Gladstone and the surrounding communities and what all this information means for the Oak Lodge study area and the governance project in particular. So with that, just want to kind of set the stage for those who might not be particularly familiar. So we're talking about specifically the Oak Lodge study area, which consists of the unincorporated portion of Clackamas County between Milwaukee and Gladstone. So you can see here we have Milwaukee as its own incorporated city to the north, and then Gladstone as its own incorporated city to the south, with this large urbanized yet unincorporated region between the two. Given that it's unincorporated, the study area is represented by the 5 Clackamas County commissioners, who not only represent the study area, but the entire Clackamas County. So because of that, it is, given that counties are typically governing rural areas, or their form of government is rural in nature, it seems only fair to say that it is essentially a rural form of government for this uniquely urban yet unincorporated region. So because of this, the Oak Lodge governance project has looked at, through a consulting firm called Eco Northwest, looked at the potential of annexing into Milwaukee to the north and then incorporating as their own city. And what I'm looking at in this analysis, in this presentation and subsequent report, is annexing into Gladstone, and then also incorporating as a study area as their own city, but with the same services provided by Gladstone. So I want to very briefly touch on the concept of annexation, which is essentially the process by which an unincorporated area legally becomes part of an existing city. And so the state of Oregon has many different processes for doing this, codified in state law. And they're listed here, they're in the report in more detail. I won't go through them all necessarily, but all this to say that there's various processes by which a community or a group of people can decide to annex into an existing city. And that can be either through the consent of the people living in that area to annex, or or for example, the elected officials of the city that would absorb the unincorporated area could also initiate a proposal to annex. And so what's listed here on the screen are the state requirements, and it is possible that the city of Gladstone may have either additional requirements or more explicit processes, but I was not able to get that information from the city of Gladstone. So I want to really quickly, before diving into some more information and data, talk about methodology, which is really my way of explaining that there are definitely some caveats with this information and this process. Um, as you'll see, a lot of the analysis is based on the existing budgets and the budgets specifically for fiscal year 2021. And given that there are different schedules, financial schedules, and fiscal year schedules for Milwaukee and Gladstone and Clackamas County, they're all on different sort of cadences. I had to make some assumptions and some estimates in terms of the numbers used, and those are all outlined in the report, but I just want to make it clear during this presentation that the numbers that I discuss are definitely intended to be illustrative and by no means a formal or explicit estimation or forecast, because I'm not a taxation or public finance expert, but I hope that what they can do is provide a good context for discussion moving forward. And so similarly, as I mentioned, these numbers are from the fiscal year 2021 budgets. They are what we're calling essentially a snapshot in time analysis, meaning they are numbers that are based on priorities and policies established by the existing elected officials, and they can change. And so for the purposes of this analysis, I had to use sort of parameters and just use the information that that was available. And so it is a moment in time which will come up through this discussion, especially as we're talking about services and things. So with all that out of the way, I want to talk about the city of Gladstone itself and the services they provide. So the city of Gladstone is a fairly small city. You'll see here on that same map, Gladstone, as I mentioned, is to the south of the study area. And it's about 4 square miles in size, and it was incorporated in 1911. It's very much a residential community and was originally incorporated to provide housing for workers at the nearby mill. It's a small city in terms of geography and residents. It has about 12,000 residents as of the most recent Portland State University Population Center estimate. And for those 12,000 residents, it has a fairly large elected body. There's a 6-member city council plus a mayor that has the ability to cast a vote when discussing policies and things. So you'll see later on that it is a fairly large elected body for a city of this size. And the city is very much a full service city. It has its own police department, its own fire department. It has community development materials and ordinances, but contracts with Clackamas County to implement those ordinances. Similarly, it, up until very recently, has had its own, library and managed its own library. But moving forward, that will now be transitioned, the management will be transitioned to Clackamas County, which we'll discuss later. It has its own senior center that provides shopping services for seniors in the community and a general area to meet and do activities. Has its own parks and recreation department, has full public works, transportation, and all the forms of water infrastructure. It has municipal court for minor infractions, and then finally a government administration. It does have a city administrator, HR manager, etc., to implement all of these services. So next I want to discuss the finances, and there will be a lot of numbers shown in this portion, but I'm going to try to just call out the important ones, and then all of this information correlates directly to what's in the report. And so if there are more questions or you're looking for more information, it'll be in the report. So first, what I did is similarly, I used the same methodology that Eco Northwest used for their analysis of annexing into Milwaukee, and looked at the different anticipated revenues and expenditures for all the different services in the city, sort of scaled to match the size of and the makeup of the study area, which is significantly larger than Gladstone. So I want to call out a few specific numbers. I'm not going to go line by line here, but I want to talk about a few in particular. The first of which is transportation figure you see here highlighted in yellow. And it is, the expenditures exceed the revenues by about $500,000. And I want to call that out in particular, not because it's the biggest discrepancy, but because this does assume in the methodology that There are some projects that are currently capital projects that are currently included in Clackamas County's transportation system plan that are assumed to be absorbed by the study area, whether annexed or incorporates. And those total almost $1.5 million of capital projects. So that's assumed in the expenditures, and why that number is larger than the revenues. Similarly with wastewater, you'll see here it's quite large. The expenditures are quite more than the revenues, and that's because of what looked like it appeared that there was some debt service, and I assume that was for a capital or infrastructure project to provide wastewater service to the community. And that was done, that's not a reflection on the actual operating costs of the Oak Lodge Water Services District. It was a one-time debt taken on to provide capital. And lastly, this $200,000 for the library, as I mentioned, that the management is going to transfer from the city of Gladstone to Clackamas County. And it appears that that's done through an intergovernmental agreement where Gladstone agreed to pay Clackamas County $200,000 annually for the management of the library. I'm highlighting it here, one, to explain that, but two, also because that's one figure that was not necessarily scaled to match the proportion and the size of the study area, because it wasn't clear what that number was based on, whether it was number of visits to a library, the population, etc. So it's very possible that that number could increase in an annexation scenario. So lastly, calling out just the total difference, you see there is a deficit in the of about almost $5.5 million, all for the reasons explained. So just wanted to call that out. Yes, it might be a little alarming to see that, but it's not to worry. There are some explanations for it. And it's also, again, because of going back to the methodology, it's because this is assuming essentially a one-to-one increase in service for the population increase, which is over 200% when you factor in the study area. So I don't know that it's realistic to assume that one-to-one increase, but that's what this analysis is based on. Next, I want to talk about the property tax rate for Gladstone, because it does have a pretty high permanent property tax rate, but we'll address this later. But it has just under $5 per $1,000 of assessed value. It's about $4.8 per $1,000 of assessed value for property. And so I took that tax rate, and this is more of an exercise in sort of understanding different potentials for if the study area were to annex into Gladstone, and what the current assessed value for the study area could provide in terms of revenue with Gladstone's tax rate. So you'll see here this analysis looks at three different scenarios. There's pessimistic, realistic, and optimistic. And those are all different degrees of property value increase. And that increase could come from a variety of sources, whether it's individual home improvements, maybe there's an infrastructure project that increases property values, things of that nature. But it's three different lenses of property value increase over a 6-year period. And I don't want to go through the numbers, but what I do want to call out is that even across the three different scenarios, what I hope is clear is that there's really not that much of a difference in between all the different scenarios, but they do, regardless of the scenario, provide a very good, solid source of revenue for services. And the point I want to drive home is that the unincorporated area, the current Oak Lodge study area, is a very large tax base with a pretty high assessed value and a large population. And that any revenue provided, regardless of the scenario, would be able to generally support these additional services. And lastly, while we're still talking about Gladstone specifically, I want to touch on the values, because I am very aware that governance options and decisions are not based solely on finances. There's definitely an aspect to consider in terms of what the community values. And while there's no way to explicitly quantify what a community values, I did look at what the elected officials, who in theory represent the community, value. And so what's listed here on this screen right now, are the explicit values that the Gladstone City Council has adopted in their most recent strategic plan. And I bolded some of the key terms that I see, and mostly, as you see, livability. It's a strong focus on economy, workforce, financial stewardship for the city. And we'll come back to this and discuss this in detail, but I kind of just wanted to plant the seed here. While we're still talking about just Gladstone, these are the values that their elected body has identified. Next, I want to talk about what I'm calling option 5, which builds upon options 1 through 3 in the Eco Northwest report. Gladstone annexation will be option 4. And now option 5 would be the study area incorporating as its own city, but with Gladstone services, the same services that Gladstone provides. And so what I did is I essentially tried to determine what the base level of property tax rate would need to be for the study area to provide enough revenue to fund these services. And so in doing that, again, this is a good example of a calculation that was largely point in time and has a lot of caveats, which I'll mention momentarily. But what I found to be the lowest possible permanent tax rate, and emphasis on permanent, for the study area would be $3.27 per $1,000 of assessed value. And you may remember the Gladstone rate that is significantly lower than the Gladstone permanent tax rate. And while I'm assuming, and this is one of the caveats, I'm assuming that to be the case because I'm assuming that the assessed value, even when controlled for population and size, is generally lower in Gladstone, meaning they would need a higher rate per assessed value, per unit of assessed value to cover the costs of the services. So again, this is a point in time assessed value, and this only considers a portion of the revenues, because as you probably know, cities don't just function from property taxes, they also get money from the state and other sources. And so this tax rate assumes that the same proportion of property tax revenue that Gladstone has had for the last 5 or 6 years would apply to the study area. And then again, this assumes a 1-to-1 service level increase, meaning if there were 10 police officers in Gladstone and the population is twice as big in the study area, there would be 20 police officers in the study area. I don't think that that's necessarily realistic, but again, that's an assumption that had to be made for the analysis. And so finally, the takeaway from this brief option is that this tax rate of $3.27 per $1,000 of assessed value should really be considered, I would say, the lowest possible tax rate for these services. And that I want to note that establishing a higher tax rate will allow for future flexibility and/or improved services, because the state of Oregon does have some pretty strict property tax rate laws, one of which is that these tax rates, once established, are permanent and they do not change through legislation or levy increases. So with that discussion out of the way, I want to now actually compare what I've discussed now and with the Eco Northwest findings. The first thing I want to talk about is representation, and this is representation from the elected officials. I mentioned a little bit, I didn't have the slide necessarily dedicated to it, but mentioned throughout a bit of the representation piece. But now I want to walk through each option and explain the differences, because there's some pretty stark differences here. And this is definitely a key consideration for governance. And again, this is an example of something it's not financial, but it does make a big difference in living your lives and being part of a community. So option 1 is sort of the control option, in which things remain as they are, which is unincorporated Clackamas County, where the residents of Oak Lodge are governed by the 5 Clackamas County commissioners. And when you factor in the entire Clackamas County population, that calculates to just over 90,000 residents per elected official, which is a large number of residents. And then option 2, we're looking at Milwaukee, which Eco Northwest assessed. They have 4 councilors plus a mayor with voting rights. And so you see here when you factor in the Milwaukee population plus the study area population, there would be about just under 10,000 residents per elected official. Option 3, incorporating as a new city, that depends. There's no way of knowing without actually going through the incorporation process how many elected officials there would be. Option 4 for Gladstone, they, as I mentioned, have a very large elected body of 7 elected officials total and a small population. So when you factor in the small population, large number of elected officials, you get a very small ratio in terms of representation, where there would be about just over 5,500 residents per elected official, which is the lowest ratio on this of these examples, and meaning there's the most representation for each resident. And then option 5 is similar to option 3 because they're both incorporations. So this again would depend. Next, I want to put all the services on one screen. I know this is a lot to look at, but I think for me, it helped paint a picture and a solid understanding of which service was provided by which entity under each option. And so you can see here on the left column, there's the 5 options outlined, and then across the top, the various services provided. And then sort of in the body of the matrix or the table, it tells you who provides what service. So CO is for county, CI is for city, SD is special district. You see those are largely the water and wastewater. And then some of them have overlap where, for example, the stormwater is provided by either the county and a special district or the city and special district. And there's the table in the bottom left if you need a color coding. I know it helps me for sure. And what I really want to call out, other than providing this as a resource just to understand who's providing what, is 2 examples of cost per unit of service. And this is one way, not the only way, but one way to talk about efficiency in providing various services. So for example, because there's a pretty stark difference. So I want to talk about police and fire because that data is pretty readily available. And so I was able to determine these figures. But when we're looking, for example, at the cost per unit of service for police, which is the cost per call, and these calls can range from really, really minor things to investigating a death. So they run the gamut in terms of intensity and time, but for the purposes of this analysis, I just looked at the general number of calls and then the total expenditures spent that year on all those calls. So when you're looking at police, which for Clackamas County is the sheriff's office, for the study area, they spent about $502 per call. And then for the entire county, which is a very large county, they spent about $857 per call for the sheriff's office, which I think to me makes sense given the larger the area, there's more, maybe not even patrolling necessary, but just more vehicles, more staff, I imagine, to cover the service area. And then similarly with police, with fire, the Clackamas County Fire District, I did the same thing, taking the number of calls that fire department had and dividing that by, or the expenditures spent by the number of calls. And that's pretty expensive, just over $3,000 for both the study area and the entire district, meaning the study area had almost identical proportion to the entire Clackamas County Fire District. And so when you compare those to what Gladstone provides and how much they spend on providing their services, Gladstone is significantly less. And I am largely assuming this to be because of, again, the significantly decreased size of the city. I just imagine that provides many efficiencies. And so when you're looking at police, their average cost per incident was just over $200 per incident. And then fire was over $1,300 on average per incident. So you can see those are both significantly less than the Clackamas County services. And next I want to talk about some more money, finances, the tax bill. And this table, I won't spend too much time here, but this is largely outlining the estimated tax bill for each of the governance options at different property value rates. So I'll go through each of these individually because there's some important things to note that go beyond just the numbers you're seeing. So for option 1, which is the unincorporated option as things currently stand, this is the lowest or low permanent property tax rate, but with that also a low service level. These are as things are as they stand right now. So Clackamas County Sheriff's Office for police, Clackamas County Fire for fire, parks, the North Clackamas Parks and Recreation District for parks and recreation. So you're paying less to Clackamas County, but compensating for those other services to the special districts. And with this lower tax bill, not only is there a lower service level, but there's it would sustain the concerns that I've heard through the people I've spoken with about this project, the community members about this project, the concerns, which are that right now for Oak Lodge and the study area, there's not much of there's really no sense of localized government. There's not a strong emphasis on community development, which I know is of particular interest. And there's no real central hub for community members to go to seek information, to advocate for policy, to ask questions, things of that nature. So this is a fairly low tax bill, but it also, again, has the lowest service level of the options we're looking at. And then option 2, which is the Milwaukee annexation. Milwaukee has an average tax rate, but the highest tax bill of those that we've looked at. But with that, you definitely get increased services. And so Milwaukee seems to really place a lot of emphasis on community development and working with community members to develop a vision for Milwaukee. And I'm pulling that out. You'll see now and moving on. I talk about community development a lot just because I understand that is an important issue for a lot of the study area residents. And in this scenario, Milwaukee residents are paying special districts for parks and recreation and fire services. Option 3, this is the first incorporation option that Eco Northwest put together. And you'll see here at the bottom, there's a big disclaimer, and I want to call that out specifically, that this is just one example for incorporation. Until you go through the incorporation process, there's no way of knowing what the actual property tax rate would be because it's determined by the services folks want for their community. So this is the example that was used, and it's a pretty base level, bare bones example. And so I would assume this to be the lowest property tax rate possible for the services included. So with that said, this is a low permanent tax rate and a low property tax bill, still relying on the special district for parks and recreation and fire. But what this would provide from the other two we've talked about is complete autonomy because you would be an incorporated city. And again, this is purely a base level, no additional services or priorities specifically identified. So those first 3 options are what Eco Northwest put together. And then I want to build upon that by talking about the Gladstone annexation, which, as I mentioned earlier, Gladstone has the highest permanent property tax rate, but it's more of an average tax bill because not as much residents are spending less on the special districts to provide the services because the city would then provide them, like the police and fire services. So some important changes to call out here are the Gladstone urban renewal area. Gladstone the voters in Gladstone did approve an urban renewal area, which is essentially them saying, we've identified an area we want to improve and we're going to pay for it. So they have agreed to pay an increase on their tax bill with those funds going directly to improving that specific area. And similarly, they've also identified that they want to increase police and fire service more than the base level service was provided. And so back in I think it was 1998, Gladstone voters approved both the police and fire levy, which has been renewed 4 or 5 times through today. And that's a levy of an additional 68 cents and 31 cents for each of $1,000 of assessed value on top of their tax bill to increase police and fire services. And I want to call those out not only to explain an increased tax bill, but as an example of what an incorporated community can do in terms of identifying a need or a desire for increased service, saying we're willing to pay for it, and then doing it. And then, as I mentioned, Gladstone does typically have a more efficient cost per unit of service for the public safety services. And finally, the second incorporation option, this is incorporating with Gladstone service levels as opposed to that more base level of services that Eco Northwest looked at. And this does have a lower permanent tax rate. But again, I want to stress it should be assumed to be the bare minimum. And this is assuming that, again, the Gladstone level of service would be, or what the residents would want. It does produce a pretty average tax bill when comparing to the other options. And then as with the other, the Gladstone example, it has more city provided services as opposed to relying on special districts. And then it provides complete autonomy because again, it is an incorporated community. And then finally, there is that more generally efficient cost per unit of service, which I don't know could be assumed to carry over to this option as the city area is much larger than Gladstone, but I wanted to call it out. And finally, this slide is one I'm excited about. There's a lot to look at here, so I'll walk everyone through it, but I think this is a really fun and interesting slide to look at. So I mentioned earlier, we talked through the Gladstone values and goals, and I wanted to put that in comparison with both Milwaukee and Clackamas County, the other two kind of jurisdictions we're talking about. And so what I did is I looked at the, tried to find the most comparable goals, visions, etc. I'm using those terms pretty interchangeably, even though I know they're not really interchangeable, but and for this discussion, looked at what the elected officials had identified as values and goals through their policies or plans, and tried to identify each, put each individual goal into a general bucket, and then show across those jurisdictions where that bucket is represented in their goals and where it's not. And you'll see here, so I had a little color coding system, green, yellow, and red, where the green is I felt like it was clearly expressed in their goals, not much to discuss. Yellow felt it was, I personally made a case for it being sort of extrapolated that it could be expressed, but I like the term wasn't used, or I don't know that that's essentially where they were, what the intent behind the goal was. And then, so the yellow ones are definitely up to interpretation, and I will say that it is my interpretation. And then finally, red, meaning that I don't think the goal or that bucket was really represented in the goal. So I have each of the goals listed down here for reference for the jurisdictions, but I really just want to focus on the actual table and go across each jurisdiction. So Milwaukee has two clearly identified goals, one focused on climate change mitigation and resilience, and the other focused on equity, justice, and inclusion. But I feel like those two pieces are very, very, very large and cover a lot of ground. And so you'll see that represented here. So Milwaukee, I felt like the general economy, which is I was thinking to be more workforce and sustaining the economy of the city, not the actual city's operations, which I considered fiscal responsibility for the purposes of this discussion. So I said that economy was slightly expressed for Milwaukee, mostly because of the focus on resilience. I think that is key, and climate change mitigation, both of which are key to maintaining a solid economy. Similarly, I feel like they really, really addressed environment, climate, and inclusion. Those are clearly discussed in their goals, but I didn't feel that fiscal responsibility for the city was really expressed. And lastly, safety and infrastructure. I would make a case for them being expressed in their goals because safety, I feel like you could extrapolate that from the equity, justice, and inclusion, and infrastructure definitely relies upon resilience. And finally, there's this forward thinking category that I put in because and that was, I will say, largely inspired by the Milwaukee goals because I felt like they were very, in particular, responsive to current issues and trying to help plan for the future for the community. Next, I want to talk about Clackamas County. So there, you'll see here that I said that I felt that economy was clearly expressed in their goals, whereas they didn't really address the actual fiscal sustainability of the county as a government. I felt like they talked about environment in terms of natural resources, but didn't really address actual climate and climate change. So you'll see I obviously called those two components out, environment versus climate change, for those two reasons. No clear goal about inclusion, but they do mention safety, safe communities, and similarly they mention strong infrastructure for the county. And I said that for forward thinking, it was slightly expressed purely, and I'll say the same thing for Gladstone, both of which are forward thinking in the sense of having goals to address future needs and policies, but I don't think that they were as explicitly called out as Milwaukee. And finally, Gladstone, they had a very strong focus on economy and fiscal responsibility for the county and sustainability for the county's, for the city's finances, but did not really address environment, climate, inclusion, or safety as clearly as Milwaukee's goals did. I put infrastructure as slightly expressed because they mentioned civic building needs, and I assumed that part of the fiscal responsibility is to promote and maintain infrastructure. So I know this is a lot to discuss and look at, but I wanted to put it all on one slide purely for conversational purposes and provide a comparison, because what I hope is clear is that even though these communities are not far from one another, they appear to have very different priorities. And I personally am making absolutely no judgment about the three or the different goals or values, but I want to call them out because I know that it will be important for community members as they're talking about governance to understand what the community they might be joining or modeling themselves after values. So finally, my last slide, thank you for sticking in there. My last slide is about just general considerations for this discussion and what I've presented. And the first is state revenue. And this is really, I didn't mention this explicitly, but just wanted to call out that the state of Oregon does provide revenue to cities, but you can only get that if you are an incorporated city. So whether you annex or incorporate as your own city, that doesn't matter in terms of receiving the revenue, but you don't get it unless you are an incorporated city. Next, I want to call out the additional services that Gladstone would provide in comparison to the other governance options. So there's the Parks, Fire, and Senior Center. Those three things are different from all the other governance options. Annexing into the city of Gladstone would provide the highest elected official representation. And then wanted to call it again, those police and fire levies, which I did talk about. And then community development, again, I wanted to kind of provide this comparison of Gladstone community development to Milwaukee community development, where they both definitely comply and meet state requirements. And the state does have some pretty strict requirements on process and policies for community development. But I feel like whereas Gladstone is, given that it's maybe a small city and doesn't prioritize as much the actual community development aspect of the city, they meet state requirements, but Milwaukee really seems to place a lot of value and resources for community development, where they host not only a state required planning commission, but they also have many different community groups that are focused purely on developing visions for the community. And finally, just a little technical note that I don't know if I explicitly mentioned, but is definitely worth clarifying, that purely because of geography and state of Oregon law, Jennings Lodge would need to be the first portion of the study area to annex, because it has to be adjacent to the city so that they're annexing into. So Jennings Lodge is the closest and abutting to Gladstone. So they would, if residents decide to annex into Gladstone, that's would need to be the first part of the community to do so. So having said all of that, I want to just explicitly call out what I think can be done with this information and what I hope it provides to not only the Oak Lodge Governance Project Steering Committee, but the general community. And I hope it sort of completes the puzzle or paints a complete picture of the different governance options in the area. So Eco Northwest did a very, very, very wonderful job talking about annexing into Milwaukee and incorporating for the study area. And I hope that this provides the complementary information to have the same discussions about annexing into Gladstone and then similarly incorporating, but with a different service level. And so I hope this can provide a wonderful resource for in the library that this group is building. And I'm happy to answer any questions. So with that, thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you all and we can talk about your questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alexander. And just before we get into the other specific questions, just while you're still sort of, warmed up from all of this, I
Yes.
wonder, what is it that what do you feel like you really learned or came away with from this investigation? So we could get sort of a higher altitude idea on that. What do you feel that you really came away with from all this?
Yes. Eleanor, are you asking what I personally came away with?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. A lot. It was so what this project felt like to me was a culmination of everything I've studied over the last 2 years. So we're talking about
Right.
Anything from public works, the anatomy of the city is how my professor called it, to finances, to different laws that are particularly in Oregon, very, very, very applicable regarding property taxes and land use and things like that. And for the sake of the presentation, I didn't always go into those details, but they are in the final report, some more summaries about the applicable laws and things. And so really to answer your question, it felt like a great exercise in applying basically everything I learned through this program and just my general interest and experience in Oregon local government.
Great. And just for the clarification for everyone, as part of earning his master's degree, this is what's considered his capstone project. And the purpose of that is to really incorporate all those different things. So it's so fabulous to have this real life example for you to really participate in and provide this phenomenally useful and valuable information, both to the Oak Lodge Steering Committee for the Oak Lodge Governance Project, but for the community as a whole in terms of providing this information. So with that, I just want to turn it over to other members who are here. And if they have different questions or things like that, or comments that people would like to make, if you want to raise your hand, Chips. Yeah, if you want to unmute yourself.
Well, thank you. That was enlightening. There were a lot of, you have a lot of approaches there that, I certainly haven't thought about, maybe none of us. A couple of things. The chart on values that compares them, where you made your own analysis, I think that's really interesting. And it's one of those things that could be studied for a long time, and the mayor of Milwaukee might have different opinions about that, as well as some people from Gladstone, because they're working on certain areas that they believe. But I love that you did that, because you are looking with a objective view from the outside, and this is what you saw. One thing that I'd like to ask you about that I'm almost feel remiss that we didn't ask you about earlier, and I'm not sure how to deal with this, when that was very enlightening about the Clackamas County Police and the comparison of those costs. And I think that's going to be very handy as we move ahead. But you made the point earlier that they have their own parks department, and it would be really helpful if we could sort of do the same kind of comparison, because now there's a lot of talk about parks because of what's going on right now currently in the community, particularly at the Concord School, with the Parks Department and the lack of parks that we have here, and where's the money been going, and why hasn't it not been spent on our parks. And so it would be nice if we had that would give us a little insight, if we could see how they do their parks compared to the way Clackamas County does its parks for us. And that way we could, yeah, and to compare Gladstone with our area, the way, if we could, I don't know how difficult that would be to go in there now and to do that, but that would probably be very helpful, certainly for a lot of us that are working in the area of parks at this point.
That could be a really great future project. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be very, very handy. But thank you, Alex. It's this is certainly helpful.
Absolutely. And just to respond to your question or point, Chips, luckily the report has not been submitted yet. And that is pretty easy in terms of, if you want a same comparison to what I did for police and fire, it would be fairly straightforward to do that for parks, assuming data exists and is available. So I'm happy, more than happy to see what's available and include that in the report if I can find something.
Fabulous.
That would be handy. Yes, thanks.
Really fabulous. Great. Thank you for your flexibility, Alexander. That's great.
Absolutely.
That's great. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? I know that I had a thought at the very beginning, you know, when you're talking about the size of Gladstone and stuff, to just let, you know, other folks listening in understand that Oak Grove, because the study area is the CPO boundaries basically of Oak Grove and Jennings Lodge. And Oak Grove is about 6 square miles and Jennings Lodge is about 1 square mile. And again, as you showed in your various charts, the combined population of the Oak Lodge area, those two CPOs together, is about 28,000. So just recognizing City of Milwaukee, the City of Gladstone, what are their comparable sizes just geographically and population wise, and how large the Oak Lodge area is in both those ways. So what the impact may be in those ways, just to note that as we move forward. So other questions or comments for Alexander? Come on, this is the chance to grill him on this stuff. I know we've gone through these things before, different ideas. So I'm going to start putting you on the spot. I'm going to call on you. Don't do it. Don't do it. I wanted to thank you very much for including that idea of how can the community best use this material going forward. And again, as the Oak Lodge Governance Project keeps gathering material to help inform the residents of this area of what are the different options before us, this fills in a huge piece in terms of that information to help really round out the way that people can better understand what their governance options are for this area. So I want to really appreciate the caveats that you included as well. And
Yes,
Valerie,
half of this
and then Jane.
was caveats, but I think it's worth noting all of them. And before I forget, and I know there sounds like there's some other questions, but just to respond to that, Eleanor, and I meant to include this at the end, I wanted to say thank you to this group, because I know this is very much a grassroots community-led initiative. And I think I know it's a ton of work and the hours that this group has put in, but I think it will, the efforts will be enjoyed by many generations to come, regardless of the outcome. So this is a wonderful, wonderful initiative, and I think it's going to be so beneficial to the community.
Thank you. Thank you.
My question, and if you feel like you're not ready to answer that, that's fine, you pass. I would just say, as someone who's been studying these kind of issues and has kind of looked at this overview now, what do you think, what would you suggest or advise are the most important pieces for a community to be looking at as they consider governance?
Good question, a big question, but I think probably the most important piece, and maybe again another caveat, that this, for the purposes of this study, we of course looked at the entire study area, but I think it's probably safe to say that not the entire Oak Lodge study area wants to do the same thing. And so I think when you're talking about governance, the next, I would say that now that you have all this information and this data, that the next step would really be figuring out what the community wants, what the Oak Lodge area wants, and where those desires land on the map. Because fortunately or unfortunately, geography is a big component in consideration when talking about these things, because again, annexation requires that you be adjacent or abutting an existing city. So it would probably be best to consider, again, what those desires are and where they land, because that would really inform next steps. And it's very possible that a large portion, any size portion of the community wants to stay as it is, and that's okay if that's what they want. But it's important to know who wants what to determine the next step. So when you're looking, so in terms of understanding what's next, I would say that. But in terms of what's important to consider when you're actually trying to have those conversations or make the decisions, would really similarly be important to identify what's important to you, because what I hope is clear from this presentation is that the communities, the cities vary drastically in terms of, again, values, services, efficiencies. And so if you are willing to, let's say, pay more for more service, then that might steer you in one direction, versus if it's what's most important to you is remaining autonomous, and you'd be happy to have a low service level, but be your own city with your own elected body and everything, then I think incorporation in either of the scenarios would be better. So I know that was a long answer with not a real solid answer, but I hope that provided some more information, Valerie.
No, thank you. I think that's really helpful. So
Yeah. Jane, you had your hand up?
Well, just in the same vein, I wanted to thank Alexander for that display graphic with the different qualities or values, even though they might have been intuitive, that you put your own thought to them after you examined all of their revenues. It was probably the first time that we were able to see something laid out that actually gave us some balance and understanding of what is valued in the charters of different communities around us and what we might want to look for. So thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I found it very insightful as well. So it was a fun exercise.
Yeah, it's really fun. And Joseph, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Eleanor. And thank you, Alexander. I really appreciate your analysis and all the work that you put into this. You did an excellent job. What I'm wondering, so it sounded like, with response to Valerie's question that, we should probably do some public polling research. But in addition to that, and in addition to taking the temperature of the community and, determining, what the values are and matching those to, services and service levels, what do you think that the next steps in terms of data gathering and analysis and that kind of research do you think should be prioritized for us?
Yeah, that is a great question. And the first thing that comes to mind is, and this would need to be, this sort of stems off from some of the other decisions we already talked about, but I think if incorporation is how the group or some of the community would like to move forward, there's a list of essentially requirements from the state that go pretty far in depth about collecting all kinds of data, generally some feasibility analyses, and I don't remember them all off the top of my head, but they are listed in the report. So there's definitely some technical data that would need to be done and collected and analyzed to move that direction. And I will note, and I know Eco Northwest made this very clear in their report, but it's not a cheap route. It is expensive, because I'm assuming you'd have to pay folks, consultants, to collect that data and do the reporting and analysis necessary. So that's one piece. And then there's definitely some other, what I would consider data, maybe not hard numbers, but there is an aspect of working with the existing communities and the existing cities and understanding how they would respond to this request and how they could help. And I'm sure they would have a whole list of other questions, and that would very likely result in some data gathering and collection. So I don't know that I have an exact answer for like what numbers you would provide or need to provide, but I'm sure that they would be very happy to tell you what data they would like, and I'm sure there's anything from demographic data to more specifically like income data, maybe some more a better understanding of actually this would be a really helpful piece, is doing a pretty thorough land use analysis of what the existing zones are in the study area and maybe what revenues could be generated from those, and if there's any discrepancies between sort of the general assessed value approach that I took versus a commercial property providing, because I know some cities will really would like to understand what sort of tax revenue they could bring in depending upon the actual land zone, etc. So again, long-winded answer, but I hope that's helpful, Joseph.
And Chips, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I want to pursue that a little more, just that same, the same subject, but ask it in a little different way, which is, and this question, the response to this would be sort of a sophisticated gut response. It's a gut response with all of the information that you've been collecting. And that is, let's assume that this group decides, okay, we've done this, we're gonna really go balls out for incorporation. So let's just say we do that, we make that assumption, knowing many of us who've lived in this community for a long time, that the primary consideration in many of the potential voters are strictly financial. And they, what's it going to cost? How much is it going to cost? How much more is it going to cost for this fancy city that you guys are putting together? Okay, so it's going to cost more. What would you say would be the primary things to say to these people for the reason for raising their cost with all of the information that you've got? And I know that's subjective, but this is a question we'll be asking a lot of people henceforth. So what would you say if you were going to explain, well, this is going to cost you X amount more, but here's why?
Yeah, I was a little nervous about what the question was going to be, Chips, with that lead up, but I am confident in my answer with this one. It would be really increased representation, which I think stems off into a lot of things. So with being in your own city, your own incorporated city, you would not only have the autonomy to decide what services and at what levels are provided, the number of elected officials and everything, but once you've gotten past that, the elected officials would then be representing such a smaller, more direct, quantifiable area and group of people that could then promote policies, and the residents could then probably feel more comfortable and more feel more like their time would result in something, going to those elected officials and saying, I want X, I think we should do Y, things of that nature. So really it's the representation piece that I feel is most important and worth really explaining, because yeah, the tax bill for residents might increase anywhere from $20 to $70 more per month, but is it important? I guess the question you'd have to ask is that a price you're willing to pay for increased representation and the ability to really have much more skin in the game when it comes to creating your community?
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Alexander. And I feel like that sort of wraps up the topic for the day. Just one last call for any, questions or comments or something like that. But I want to thank you so much for all your involvement and engagement and participation in this, and meeting with us so many times and going through these different things. It's a huge benefit to the project and to all the residents in the community. So Alexander, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Very, very,
Great.
very welcome. And thank you all for your wonderful engagement and input. It's been fun to not only do the work, but get to know you virtually. So wonderful.